So when I turned 18, in fact, the day after I turned 18, I went to the local draft board and said I would like to go with the next quota. And at the central examining station, at that quota, which occurred about a month after I was 18, they accepted me for service into the Army. At that time, there was a period when Franklin Roosevelt publicly said we must build 30,000 airplanes, and they were in the process of trying to catch up in aviation. But in the meantime, we needed air defense badly. And so that there was a tremendous research and build-up in air defense activity and aircraft and radar, something very, very, very new at that time. And so I was, not voluntarily, but just in the draft, sent to New England, where they had training for anti-aircraft battalions. And the new weapon was the first radar purchased by the United States Army. The new draftees were rounded up, put aboard a train, and transported to New England from Pennsylvania. Curtains drawn. We didn't know where we were going, and it was middle of the night when we disembarked. It was a training base for anti-aircraft battalions. The weapon was the 90 millimeter cannon, and it was guided by mechanical instruments for its pointing, so to speak. But in addition to that, you've probably all seen the searchlight beams from war movies and so forth. They had invented a primitive radar so that they could use searchlight beams that pick up the target quickly. Once they picked up visually, the old optical height finders were used so that they could get the right data to the guns. So that was the earliest use for radar at that time, just to point to searchlights. And someone came up with the bright idea that all of this data that radar is picking up, we can send that directly to our own computers and actually fire the guns based on the radar data. So I became a crew member of this huge hay-rack gadget that gave images, range and data on moving airborne objects. By Pullman train to California, then troop transport to Hawaii. And Hawaii, we got 6 to 8 months of jungle training. And at that time, they were starting to take the islands in the Pacific as their climb towards Japan. Eventually, I ended up in the Marianas campaign and our invasion of Saipan. And at Saipan, we set up our weapons and used it in anti-aircraft work for Japanese incursions that were trying to stop us from rebuilding the runway and so forth. Probably about 3 miles from the runway. It was a Japanese field called Aslito, and it was being paved and rebuilt for eventual B-29 use. And that was the whole object of taking the island, so they could be within range of Japan with the B-29. The Japanese were still there and owned about 1/3 of the island. And so we had to set up, burying ourselves in like infantrymen, and
what kind of tactics did the Japanese aircraft use when they attacked the island?
They were confined to the island of Rota, which is just north of Guam. Guam hadn't been taken yet. If you could just picture the chain running north and south. Guam, Rota, Tinian, and then Saipan, about 2 miles from Tinian. Saipan was taken, and then when it was secured, meaning it was not totally occupied, but just secured, the 4th Marines, whom we were attached to, got clean clothes, got in their amphibs, went to 2 miles over and took Tinian, and then eventually on down to Guam. But we were still at Saipan, still areas that were not secured as yet. So we had a ground defense we had to set up, plus we had to get our anti-aircraft guns prepared because the constant raids from the Japanese aircraft from Rota, the island down the way. They used what we called a Betty, and it was a twin-engine, very effective modern bomber.
And when did they choose to attack?
They attacked every night. We did 85 firing courses during our time there.
How effective was the radar?
It was very effective when all the conditions were perfect. And they were imperfect when it was a crowded sky. During our early coming ashore, our radar, being taken off the LST and down the ramp, broke the tongue on the radar. And the radar itself was a huge four-wheeled vehicle, almost like a locomotive with a cab at one end and all of the electronic stuff in between, and then the antenna out in front. That poor radar had to sit out with the incoming tide overnight until we got another tractor to pull it out of the drink. And when they finally got to the shore, our people had to crawl underneath and short out the wires to get the air blowers going because it was tube electronics and it needed air conditioning to keep them cool. So we had visual operation for a while before we got the radar going. When we did get it going, we had a night of a single bomber coming in, and they were bombing in areas where they thought we were working on the field. And we weren't particularly, but we could actually see the Betty flying up the valley. And because it was one of those partially illuminated skies and no searchlights at that time, but we could see the exhaust. So able to get a good track lock on in radar, and that data is sent to the computer and also backed up by visual height finder, and we were able to get a pretty good pattern of air bursts. And when we did, there must have been a fragment from one of the fixed ammo that burst because the engine in the airplane started to burp, 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 and we knew we had made a hit. I mean, there was no big thing of the airplane blowing up or diving in flames or anything like it, but something hit their engine, and that airplane then refused to fly, and it started downward plunge, and it was a killer. But throughout the night, scattered all around us that we couldn't see, were Marines dug in, and 27th Army dug in, and so forth. We didn't even know they were there, but they were there and still trying to secure the island. When that airplane became disabled, it made a noise when it did, there was a cheer that sounded like the whole stadium opened up. It was amazing. Like somebody had a football score. So we didn't even those folks were dug in out there, but they all were cheering to see that that pesky bomber at last was shot down. So that was a very thrilling night. Its accuracy depended a lot on being able to separate your aircraft from the enemy's aircraft. And to do that was a primitive device, identification friend or foe, that was so primitive that it gave a huge signal on the scope, and the cells to operate tracking of the beast, a separate device altogether from the radar, was always a little bit delayed. So in other words, the airplane would be up here, and to swing over to see if he's a goodie or a baddie might be somewhat of a delay. So you didn't really know whether you were shooting at a friendly or an enemy. So you had to cool it and take your time and hope that you got no signal at all. But getting no signal is not a signal to tell you there's no signal. There was a night when we opened fire on a C-47 coming back, and it wasn't accurate. We were too excited or too nervous. One of the devices in the system might have been off a bit. So our bursts were nowhere near, but they were close enough to know the guy was being shot at. And when that got up the line, the headquarters, we had all the staff officers in the world came down to visit us to see what really went wrong. The airplane was not hit. I'm sure the passengers got a very rough ride, but that was the only time we had a close accident of friendly fire.